You need to move your chair. The lieutenant needs room. My mother's voice cut through the laughter, and 20 pairs of eyes turned to watch me drag a folding chair to the corner. Not one of them knew their daughter wore stars on her shoulders. The drill sergeant's voice cracked across the training field. "General." Every recruit froze. My brother's rifle hit the ground. His mouth fell open as he stared at me, the sister he thought was a dropout, a failure, nothing. The shock in his eyes was everything I'd waited years to see. But the story of how we got here goes deeper than anyone in my family ever imagined. The November air bit at my skin as I climbed the familiar porch steps. That broken light still flickered above the door, casting shadows that danced like old ghosts. Through the window, I could see them all gathered around the dining table, their faces glowing in the warm light of celebration. My brother Michael sat at the head, his new lieutenant's bars gleaming on his shoulders. The banner stretched above him proclaimed what everyone already believed: their golden child had made it. I pushed open the door and the warmth hit me like a wall of memories I'd tried to forget. The smell of Mum's glazed ham mixed with cinnamon candles, the same combination from every holiday since childhood. But this wasn't about holidays. This was Michael's night, his triumph, his proof that at least one of us hadn't disappointed them. "Oh, Sarah's here," my mother announced, not looking up from arranging the centerpiece. "Michael, tell her about your commendation." She said it like I was a neighbor who'd dropped by, not her daughter who'd driven 300 miles to be here. Michael glanced at me, that same dismissive look he'd perfected in high school. They recognized my leadership scores. Top of my class in tactical operations. He turned back to our father before I could respond, launching into details about field exercises and how his commanding officer had singled him out for excellence. I stood there in my plain black jacket, watching them orbit around him like planets around a sun. No one asked about my drive. No one offered me a seat at the table properly set for everyone but me. My Aunt Patricia, already into her third glass of wine, laughed too loudly at something and gestured at my clothes. "Still wearing all that black, Sarah? You'd think at your age you'd have grown out of that phase." I wanted to tell her that some uniforms only come in dark colors, that the jacket covering my shoulders had seen 7 countries they couldn't pronounce, that the phase she mocked had saved lives they'd never know about. Instead, I smiled and went to find that folding chair my mother had mentioned, the one stored with the Christmas decorations nobody had touched in years. As I set it up in the corner, half in the dining room and half in the hallway, my father finally acknowledged me. "Still doing that administrative work? What was it, government contracting?" He didn't wait for an answer, turning to tell Michael's girlfriend about how real military service builds character, how some people just aren't cut out for the pressure. They'd created their own story about me years ago. Sarah couldn't handle West Point. Sarah cracked under the strain. Sarah disappeared one night and came back. Different. Quieter. A disappointment wrapped in black clothes and vague explanations about government work they assumed meant filing papers in some basement office. If they'd looked closer, they might have noticed things. The way I moved through their house like I was mapping exits. How I always sat where I could see every door. The small scar on my left hand from Prague that I told them came from a kitchen accident. The way I could disappear into a room's shadows without trying. A skill that had kept me alive more times than they had family photos on the wall. But they never looked closer. I was the one who'd failed, while Michael was the one who'd succeeded. Simple as that. I fetched water pitchers, cleared plates that weren't mine, refilled glasses for people who forgot my name. Each movement was precise, economical, trained. My mother's friends complimented her on raising such a helpful daughter, though they said it with that particular tone reserved for women my age without visible achievements. If only they knew that 2 months ago, I'd sat in a room with the Secretary of Defense while he asked my opinion on matters I still couldn't discuss. The party continued around me, not with me. They toasted Michael's bright future, his potential for advancement, how he'd probably make captain within 5 years. Our cousin James, fresh from business school, made jokes about military intelligence being an oxymoron. Everyone laughed. I smiled and said nothing, remembering the weight of decisions that had rested on intelligence I'd gathered, analysed and delivered to people whose names would make headlines if I spoke them aloud. The truth was carved into my bones, but it lived in classified files none of them would ever see. How I hadn't dropped out of West Point but had been recruited for something darker, something necessary. How my records had been scrubbed so clean it was like I'd never existed there. How I'd spent 12 years becoming someone whose real rank couldn't be spoken in public places, whose missions were numbered instead of named, whose very existence was need to know, and they didn't need to know. I'd sent letters home during those years. Vague, careful things that said I was fine working, travelling for the government. Mom had thrown most of them away, assuming they were form letters. Dad had stopped asking questions after the 3rd year. Michael had simply written me off as the sister who couldn't cut it. They didn't know about Moscow, where I'd spent 3 days in a basement room, maintaining a cover that saved an entire network of assets. They didn't know about Kandahar, where the intelligence I'd gathered had prevented something terrible from becoming something catastrophic. They didn't know about the medal ceremony I'd attended in a bunker 60 feet underground, where names were never spoken and faces were often covered. But the weight of what we'd done hung in the air like prayer. "Sarah, could you grab more wine from the garage?" My mother's voice cut through my thoughts. Of course I could. I was good at fetching things, at being useful in small ways that didn't threaten anyone's narrative about who mattered and who didn't. As I walked through the kitchen, I caught my reflection in the dark window. 41 years old, silver threading through hair I kept shorter than fashion suggested. Eyes that had seen too much to ever look young again. But also shoulders that carried a weight they couldn't imagine. A spine that had never broken despite their assumptions. And hands steady enough to have held the fate of strangers who would never know my name. The wine was exactly where Mom always kept it, in boxes labelled by year and occasion. This was Michael's night, so I grabbed the good bottles, the ones she'd been saving. As I carried them back, I heard my name drift from the dining room. "It's such a shame about Sarah," Aunt Patricia was saying. "All that potential wasted. And now look at Michael, achieving everything she couldn't." I stood in the doorway, bottles in hand, watching them nod in agreement. My mother added, "We tried to support her, but some people just aren't meant for greatness." The words should have hurt. Maybe once they would have. But I'd learned that there are different kinds of greatness. Some shine in daylight, celebrated and seen. Others live in the shadows, holding the line in places no one wants to admit exist. Both matter, but only one gets a banner in the dining room. I set the wine on the table, poured for everyone who held out a glass, and returned to my corner. Michael was describing his upcoming deployment, a standard training rotation that he made sound like the invasion of Normandy. His girlfriend hung on every word. Our parents beamed with pride. And I sat in my folding chair, half in and half out of their light, keeper of secrets that would shake their understanding of the world, guardian of truths they'd never have to face, successful in ways they'd never comprehend and completely, utterly invisible to the people who should have known me best. Tomorrow, I'd drive to the base to watch Michael's training exercise. Not because they'd invited me, but because I'd been asked to observe by people whose requests weren't really requests. They wanted eyes on the new lieutenant, someone who could assess without being seen. They had no idea those eyes would belong to his failed sister, the disappointment in black, the one who couldn't cut it, the one who'd actually outranked everyone in this room since before Michael even thought about enlisting. The one whose silence kept them safe in ways they'd never need to know. But tomorrow was tomorrow. Tonight, I sat in my corner and watched them celebrate the wrong hero, knowing that sometimes the greatest service you can give your family is letting them believe their own story, even when every word of it is wrong. The base looked different in morning light, stripped of the shadows I'd learned to love. I arrived early, parked in the visitors' lot, and made my way to the observation area with the kind of casual purpose that made people's eyes slide past without stopping. My clearance badge hung from my neck, the kind that looked civilian but wasn't, not if you knew what to look for. The bleachers were still mostly empty. A few contractors with clipboards, 2 parents wearing matching Support Our Troops sweatshirts, and me in my unremarkable black jacket. I chose a spot in the second row, good sight lines. Multiple exits, old habits that never died. The recruits were already forming up on the field, their movements sharp but still uncertain. That particular combination of trying too hard and not hard enough that marked new soldiers. I spotted Michael immediately. He stood straighter than the others, chin lifted like he was posing for a recruiting poster. He looked so young, so sure of himself, so utterly unaware of what real service would demand. Drill Sergeant Morrison paced in front of them. A mountain of a man whose reputation preceded him by years. I'd read his file the night before, force of habit. Decorated, dedicated, old school in all the ways that mattered. He barked orders that bounced off the morning air like bullets, and the recruits scrambled to obey. I watched Michael execute the drills, competent but not exceptional. Confident but not seasoned. He had potential, I could see that. But potential and execution were different things. I'd seen too many soldiers with potential become names on black walls to be impressed by it anymore. Morrison called for weapons drill, and the recruits scrambled to ready their rifles. The morning sun caught on metal and movement. A choreography of preparation they'd repeat until it became instinct. Michael's form was textbook perfect. Exactly what they'd taught him, no more and no less. And then Morrison's eyes swept the bleachers. It was a casual scan, the kind instructors do to check for distractions or threats. His gaze moved past the contractors, past the parents, and then stopped on me like he'd hit a wall. I saw the recognition bloom across his face, watched his spine straighten in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with protocol. His hands started to rise before he caught himself. Years of training warring with surprise, but he couldn't stop himself entirely. "General!" The word cracked across the field like a whip. His salute was perfect, instant, the kind that comes from muscle memory deeper than thought. Every recruit froze mid-motion. One rifle clattered to the ground, and I didn't need to look to know it was Michael's. The silence that followed was complete, the kind that makes your ears ring with its absence. 40 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me, trying to understand what had just happened. Why their drill sergeant had just saluted a woman in civilian clothes with more respect than they'd seen him show anyone. I stood slowly, deliberately, and returned the salute with the quiet precision of someone who'd received 1,000 of them in places these recruits couldn't imagine. Morrison held it for exactly the right amount of time, then dropped his hand and turned back to his charges like nothing had happened. "Pick up that weapon, Lieutenant," he barked at Michael, who was still staring at me with his mouth slightly open. "Unless you're planning to fight the enemy with harsh language." Michael scrambled for his rifle, his face cycling through confusion. Recognition, and something that looked like the world rearranging itself in real time. He knew my face but couldn't reconcile it with Morrison's reaction. Couldn't make the math work in a universe where his failed sister was someone a drill sergeant would salute. I sat back down, folded my hands in my lap, and watched the rest of the exercise like nothing had changed. But the energy on the field was different now. Sideways glances, whispered questions, a tension that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with trying to solve a puzzle they didn't have all the pieces for. Michael kept looking at me, his form suffering, his attention split. I could see him trying to work it out, running through possibilities and discarding them just as quickly. His sister was a nobody, a dropout, a disappointment. But drill sergeants don't salute nobodies. They don't freeze mid-stride for dropouts. They don't say general to disappointments. When the exercise ended, the recruits were dismissed to formation. But I watched Michael break rank slightly, taking a step toward the bleachers before one of his squad mates grabbed his arm. They were all talking now, voices low and urgent, trying to figure out what they'd witnessed. Morrison approached the bleachers, his walk measured and professional. He stopped at the barrier, maintaining appropriate distance but close enough to speak without shouting. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I apologize if I compromised you didn't," I cut him off gently. "Carry on, Sergeant." He nodded once, sharp and clean. "Would the General like a tour of the facilities?" "The General is just observing today," I replied, letting a small smile touch my lips. "Family business." His eyes flicked to Michael, understanding dawning. "I see." "Well, you're—" "The lieutenant shows promise. Promise isn't performance," I said, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. "No, ma'am, it isn't." He saluted again, more discreetly this time, and returned to his duties. I stayed for another hour, watching Michael struggle through the rest of his drills, his concentration shattered by questions he couldn't answer. His squad mates kept shooting glances between us, trying to see a family resemblance, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. When I finally stood to leave, Michael broke formation entirely. He jogged toward the bleachers, his sergeant shouting after him about protocol and discipline. But he didn't stop until he was standing below me, looking up with eyes that held 1,000 questions. "Sarah?" His voice cracked like he was 16 again. "Lieutenant," I replied, the formality deliberate. "But you're not." "How?" I looked at him for a long moment. This little brother who'd grown up believing his own success story while I'd been erased from every official record that mattered. Some stories aren't yours to tell, Michael. Some ranks aren't worn where families can see them. But Mom said you dropped out. Dad said you couldn't handle they said what they needed to believe, I interrupted. And I let them, because that was safer for everyone. His face was pale now, reality crashing through years of assumptions. General, you're a general, among other things. I turned to go, then stopped. Your form is sloppy when you're distracted. Work on that. I left him standing there, mouth open, world tilted off its axis. Behind him, his entire unit was watching, and I knew by evening the story would be everywhere, twisted and retold until it became legend. The mysterious general who'd appeared at morning drills, acknowledged by Morrison himself, connected somehow to the lieutenant who'd thought he was the family's only success. Let them talk. Let them wonder. Let Michael try to explain to our parents that their disappointment daughter had outranked him before he'd even enlisted. Let him try to reconcile the sister he'd dismissed with the woman Morrison had saluted. The truth was, none of them would ever get the full story. They'd get pieces, fragments, enough to know they'd been wrong, but never enough to understand how completely. And that was fine. That was necessary. That was the service I'd chosen, even if they'd never understand it was a choice. As I drove away from the base, I thought about the evening that was coming. Michael would go home. He'd tell them what he'd seen. They'd dismiss it at first, then doubt, then maybe, just maybe, begin to question everything they'd believed about their failed daughter. And somewhere in that questioning, they might find a truth more important than rank or recognition. That sometimes the people we dismiss are the ones holding the world together in ways we'll never see, carrying weights we'll never understand, succeeding in shadows while we celebrate in the light. But that revelation would be theirs to reach or not. My job wasn't to convince them. It never had been. My job was to serve, to protect, to keep the secrets that kept them safe. Even if they never knew it, even if they never believed it, even if I remained in their eyes the disappointment at the family table, sitting in a folding chair in the corner, half in and half out of the light. The knock on my hotel room door came at 2:47 a.m., soft but insistent. I was already awake, had been since the encrypted phone buzzed at midnight with a message that made my blood run cold. Winterstone compromised. Source unknown. Your authorization detected. Michael stood in the hallway holding something that made my stomach drop, an old fitness tracker I'd given him last Christmas. Except it wasn't really a fitness tracker. It was a modified field device I'd planted as a protective measure, a way to monitor if anyone ever tried to use him to get to me. Dead technology supposedly scrubbed and safe. His face was pale, eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from touching something you don't understand but know is dangerous. Sarah, this thing. It started showing. I don't know what I did, but there were codes and maps, and I pulled him inside, door closing with practiced silence. The device in his hand was active, screen showing layers of information he should never have seen. Classified operation zones, agent positions that were supposed to be dark. A web of connections that led directly back to me. How long? My voice was steady. But my mind was running calculations, probabilities, damage assessments. Maybe an hour? I was just trying to check my running stats, and I must have pressed something an hour. That meant the breach signal had already propagated through at least 3 intelligence networks. If the wrong people saw this before I could contain it, Michael wouldn't just be compromised, he'd be labeled a security threat. They'd assume he was an asset, turned or turning. The kind of assumption that ended with people disappearing into rooms they didn't come out of. I took the device, fingers flying across hidden interfaces he hadn't even found. The breach was bad but not catastrophic. Yet, the system had flagged it but hadn't elevated to critical. I had minutes, maybe less. Sit, I ordered, moving to my laptop. Don't touch anything. Don't speak. The secure partition opened with biometric confirmation. And I dove into systems most people didn't know existed. The breach was spreading like digital wildfire, triggering alerts up chains of command that would eventually reach desks where my name was both respected and feared. I initiated an emergency containment protocol, using clearance codes I'd hoped never to need again. The system fought me as it was designed to do, treating any interference as potential enemy action. But I knew its architecture had helped design some of its darker corners. Line by line, I rewrote the breach narrative, made it look like a system glitch, a ghost in the machine rather than human error. I quarantined Michael's signature, buried it beneath layers of my own authorization, making myself the sole point of failure if anyone dug deep enough. Sarah, what is this? Michael's voice was small, scared in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. It's my real job, I said without looking up. Or it was. The part you never knew about. The part nobody knew about. The containment was holding, but barely. I needed to make a choice, let it run its course and risk Michael being exposed, or take full responsibility and accept whatever consequences came. It wasn't really a choice at all. I activated a protocol I'd written years ago, a dead man's switch in reverse. It would absorb the breach, make it look like I'd been running an unauthorized protection detail on a family member. Improper but not treasonous. Questionable but not criminal. The system accepted the new narrative, warnings shifting from red to amber to yellow. The immediate threat dissolved, but I knew there would be questions, reviews, people in dark suits wanting explanations. Is it fixed? Michael asked. For you, yes. For me, I closed the laptop. That's a different story. He stared at the device in my hands, this thing that had seemed so innocent when I'd given it to him. You were protecting me? I've been protecting all of you. For longer than you know. The weight of that truth settled between us. I could see him processing, recalibrating everything he thought he knew about his failed sister. The base today. Morrison calling you General. That was real. More real than anything you've believed about me for the past 15 years. He was quiet for a long moment, then, why didn't you tell us? Because knowing would have put you at risk. Because the work I did required not existing. Because you were safer believing I was a disappointment than knowing I was... I stopped. Some words shouldn't be said, even in private. What happens now? He asked. Now you forget this happened. You go back to your training, your normal life, your normal problems. And if anyone ever asks you about tonight, you know nothing. But what about you? I thought about the calls that would come, the meetings in rooms without windows, the questions I'd have to answer or refuse to answer. I'll handle it. It's what I do. He stood to leave, then turned back. Sarah? All those times Mum and Dad said you couldn't cut it, that you weren't strong enough. You just let them believe that? Letting people believe you're weak is sometimes the strongest thing you can do. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning. I'm sorry. For all of it. For believing them. For dismissing you. For don't apologize, I interrupted. You believed what you were supposed to believe. That means I did my job right. After he left, I sat in the darkness, knowing that by morning, certain phones would ring, certain people would have questions, and certain decisions would have to be made about my future, or lack thereof. But Michael was safe. My family was safe. The network I'd spent my life protecting would remain in the shadows where it belonged. And if that meant facing whatever came next alone, well, I'd faced worse things in darker rooms. The secure facility was exactly what I'd expected: fluorescent lights, no windows, and the kind of silence that made you hear your own heartbeat. 3 officials sat across from me, their faces professionally neutral, a thick folder centered on the metal table between us. They'd been polite but thorough, walking through the breach. My response, the implications. We all knew why we were here. Dancing around words like unauthorized and compromised and liability. Finally, Colonel Harrison, whom I'd worked with during the Belgrade situation, cleared his throat. The board has reviewed the incident. Given your service record and the unique circumstances, disciplinary action has been waived. I nodded, waiting. There was always a but in these rooms. However, there it was. We believe it's time to formalize your status. Make things official. Public, even. The words hung in the air like a challenge. They slid a different folder across the table. This one marked with seals I recognized, containing papers I never thought I'd see. Full recognition. Service record unsealed, redacted appropriately. Medal of Honor consideration for Tehran. Public ceremony if you're willing. Your family would finally know no. The word came out firm, final. Harrison's eyebrow rose. No? I thought of Tehran, of the asset we'd lost because someone talked when they shouldn't have. Of Sarah Chen, whose name would never appear on any wall because she'd died protecting sources that were still active. Of the 14 men and women whose children still had parents because of operations that never officially happened. If you unseal my record, even redacted, people will connect dots. They'll look for patterns, and maybe they'll find them. I met each of their eyes in turn. How many assets are still active from my operations? How many networks still depend on the fiction that I never existed? The silence that followed was answer enough. You want to give me a medal for Tehran? I continued. The only reason Tehran worked was because nobody knew I was there. The only reason the fallout was contained was because I didn't exist. You put my name on a medal? You might as well put crosshairs on everyone I ever worked with. Admiral Torres, quiet until now, leaned forward. Your family. My family is safe because they don't know. My brother's military career is untouched because he can't be connected to me. My parents sleep soundly because their disappointment daughter is just that. Disappointing, not dangerous. You'd rather be thought a failure than risk exposure, Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I'd rather be forgotten entirely if it keeps even one asset safe. That's the oath I took. Not the public one at West Point that I never got to finish. The real one. The one in the basement room where you told me I'd have to choose between being remembered and being effective. Torres and Harrison exchanged glances. The third official, whose name I'd never been told, made notes on a tablet. There is another option, Harrison said finally. Consultant status. Official but classified. You'd have resources, support, without exposure. And my family? Would continue believing whatever they believe. I considered it. The chance to keep serving without the weight of being entirely alone. The resources to keep protecting without having to constantly watch my own back. Terms? Selective activation. Advisory role primarily. Your clearance remains intact. Your history stays buried. But you're not out in the cold anymore. It was more than I'd hoped for when I'd walked in expecting to be either celebrated or crucified. And Michael? Lieutenant Wheeler's record shows no irregularities. The incident never happened. They'd already scrubbed his name from it. Of course they had. They were offering me a gift wrapped in necessary secrets, a way to keep serving without the isolation that had defined the last decade. I accept, I said. Harrison smiled, the first human expression I'd seen from him. Welcome back to non-existence, General. It's good to have you nowhere at all. As I signed papers that would never be filed in any system accessible to anyone who mattered to me personally, I thought about Michael's question. Why didn't you tell us? The answer was here, in this room, in these documents that would cement my official non-existence while giving me the tools to keep protecting everyone who thought I'd failed. Some victories are invisible. Some heroes are disappointments. Some truths are too dangerous to speak. And sometimes the greatest love you can show your family is letting them believe a lie that keeps them safe. The desert air was different at dawn, cleaner somehow, like the night had washed it. I stood beside the transport helicopter, watching the ground crew run through final checks. Another mission nobody would acknowledge, to a place that didn't officially exist. For reasons that would never be recorded, Michael appeared out of the morning shadows, still in his training fatigues. He must have slipped away from morning PT, risking discipline to be here. He approached slowly, like he was afraid I might disappear if he moved too fast. We stood together in silence for a moment, watching the sunrise paint the mountains orange and gold. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, the kind that might hold cufflinks or a watch. Inside was a compass pin, hand-carved, not regulation, not official. The kind of things soldiers made for each other in the field when they had nothing else to give. The needle pointed true north, but there were no other markings, no rank, no insignia. Just a simple reminder of direction. I made it, he said quietly, in metalworking class. I know it's not much, it's perfect, I said, and meant it. I pinned it to the inside of my jacket, where medals would go if I wore any, where nobody would see it but I'd always know it was there. Then he did something that surprised me. He stepped back and saluted, not the sloppy, uncertain salute of a new lieutenant, but something slower, more deliberate, the kind that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with respect. I could have corrected him, told him that you don't salute someone who doesn't officially exist. Instead, I pulled him into a hug, quick and fierce, the kind we hadn't shared since we were kids and the world was simpler. Before I climbed aboard, I pressed an envelope into his hand. His name was written on the front in my careful script, the contents sealed with wax that would break if opened. When? He asked. When you need to remember that doing the right thing and getting the credit for it are two different things. When you have to choose between being seen as successful and actually protecting people. When you understand that some kinds of strength never make it into the official record. He held the envelope like it was made of glass. The rotors started to spin, the sound drowning out anything else we might have said. As I climbed aboard, I turned back once. He was still standing there, envelope in one hand, the other shading his eyes against the dust and dawn. Inside the helicopter, I pulled out the only photo I carried anymore. Not the family portrait from Mom's mantel where everyone smiled except me. Not the graduation photos that never happened. Just a worn image from my first real mission. Faces obscured by distance and time. People whose names I'd never speak but would always remember. On the back, in fading ink, words I'd written a lifetime ago: "Honor lives in silence. Keep walking." Below, Michael grew smaller as we rose, until he was just a speck against the vastness of the desert. Soon he'd go back to his unit, back to his training, back to becoming the soldier everyone could see and celebrate. And I'd go back to the shadows, to the work that no one would thank me for, to the victories that would never be recorded, to the service that required me to remain a disappointment in the eyes of everyone I loved. But now one person knew. One person had seen through the careful fiction to the truth beneath. And somehow that was enough. The helicopter banked east, toward the rising sun, toward another mission that would never make it into any report my family would see. I touched the compass pin through my jacket, feeling its small weight against my chest. True north isn't always the direction people expect you to go. Sometimes it leads through shadows and silence, through disappointment and invisibility. Sometimes it requires you to be forgotten so others can be safe. But it always leads forward, and I would keep walking.